Okay, can you hear me? Yes? Hi, I'm Allison Atterbury. I am an assistant professor at CU Boulder, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a randomized control trial that I've been working on recently with some colleagues. Daphne is one of them, and Vivian Wong at the University of Virginia. I just wanted to start out by saying that I've been feeling very nostalgic and grateful as I've been coming to this trip, and just thinking a lot about how all the work that I do and the way that I teach my students is basically a translation of the things that I've learned from the people in this room, Sean and Susanna in particular. And also, I think it's really relevant here because this partnership, my ability to do this project is also a result of the community that we have here as graduate students and the way that we learn from each other. And so when this came up for me as something I had the chance to do, I was able to turn straight to Daphne and partner with her, and that's just been incredibly influential and powerful, and I'm very grateful about it. Let's just talk a little bit about why we're doing this project. I don't think we need to say too much about this in this room, but there's a lot of hope for the idea that when we do early childhood education interventions well, they can really fundamentally change the trajectory of a child's life. You can really imagine that a child gets to hit the ground running, and there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that this is the case. Now, although it can be a clear, a strong lever for this change, it's also the case that there's growing evidence that these benefits are variable and that the initial gains that we see in early childhood may dissipate. They may not persist, or maybe they do. It's a little bit hard to say. The literature's kind of all over the place on that. But I think nonetheless, we have this urgent need right now to think very clearly about whether there is any evidence that the characteristics of these programs, something that we control, are things that we can learn about so that we can ensure that the programs that we're putting in place have a better chance of being the kinds of programs that lead to these larger and longer lasting impacts. Okay, so one candidate of one characteristic of these programs is the length of the school day. So I'm going to talk a little bit about full versus half-day preschool. And one thing that I think is really interesting in this work is I have the experience a lot of the time that I say to people, I'm studying this, and everybody says, well, I think I already know the answer to that question. But then they tell me very different things about what they think the answer is, so it makes me think that we do not know the answer to this question. I think basically there are competing hypotheses in the literature about this, among early childhood educators, and also among parents. These are all people I've talked to about this. But I think basically the arguments you hear come down to this. One is just, more school is better. It's kind of a dosage argument. The other one that you might hear kind of against it is that maybe this is actually too much stimulus for this age, and having kind of this prolonged school day has these diminishing returns. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a particularly expensive intervention because you're talking about doubling the need for your teacher workforce. So related to that is that maybe it helps, but it doesn't help in a cost-effective way. We could be using those dollars in a way that would be better for kids. And then the last one that I think is kind of interesting that I didn't know about when I started this research is that maybe having a full day schedule is actually very beneficial for parents and enables them to get more involved in work and have more flexibility in what kinds of jobs they can take on. And that in turn, of course, allows parents to have a different kind of contribution to resources for their children. And so it has this kind of indirect path. So we're going to look at quite a bit of that stuff. I'll tell you a little bit about my site. I'm working in Westminster Public Schools, which is near where I live in Boulder. It's in between Boulder and Denver. It's very close to Denver. It serves about 10,000 students a year. It's kind of a high needs district, so it's 83% free and reduced price lunch, and a large Hispanic Latino population. And just to kind of give you a sense of scope, we have one early childhood center. That's a building that's dedicated to early childhood. And then the way that this district does early childhood is that there's one preschool classroom basically in all these other elementary schools. So that's going to be kind of important for thinking about some of the design here. And I just wanted to share this kind of interesting graph about what's been going on in this place since, in this case in 2005. And one of the things that the district came to me with is this kind of concern that there's really differential performance among particularly their English language learners and English language proficient students, and that has kind of been persistently the case. I mean, this is pretty dramatic, obviously. If you're fluent, then you have a very different general outcome than you do if you're not. in this district. So they're really thinking about early childhood as being the place where they can take some populations in particular and get them into kindergarten and start them on a stronger footing so that they can be more competitive when they get into their higher grade levels. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about the research design by just kind of walking you through the steps of what we do every single year. We have 3 cohorts that we're working on, and I'll tell you a little bit about where we are on that process. But I kind of want to do it from the parent's perspective, like a time perspective. So in step 1, around this time of year, families start applying to the study and to preschool in general, and they indicate in that process that they're interested in full-day preschool. This happens between January and April. We talk about consent and the study and all that kinds of stuff, and we gather that consent and all their documents. So we have a lot of communication there. Once we have the deadline in place, we do a randomization. So in 2016, our first cohort, we randomize 113 students to an offer of full day, or 113 students to an offer of half day. Okay? In 2017, we have another round that's in preschool right now. Those cohorts are getting a little larger. We're going to do one more this year as well. At that point, of course, parents decide what they want to do with those offers. So that's important here to know that this is really about an offer, not what they necessarily decide to do. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, another really important part of this is that no matter what they choose to do, even if they decide not to enroll in Westminster at all, we continue to follow them as part of our study. So we are tracking folks that are outside the district, which is helpful and hard. Of course, then we kind of go through this process of gathering a lot of primary baseline data right when they show up in school. So the PPVT, the EZR, which is a special needs screener, is a pretty intensive special needs screener. We do this for all the kids. One way that we make this work for districts is that we actually do it for all of the kids in the district, and that's one. And then obviously we use the data for our kids in particular, which is helpful for helping us think about how our kids are different than the population as well. During the pre-K year, we also do a lot of primary data collection. So we are administering class assessments in September, November, February, and April, so observing all the classrooms. We are also going in and recording classroom time use. So we're doing classroom time use observations, AM, PM, the AM a full day, the PM a full day, to kind of get a sense of what's going on. And then we, of course, at the end of the preschool year, gather that end of year spring pre-K data. So those same things again. We are also playing around with adding something called head, toes, knees, shoulders, which is a socio-emotional measure, which I could talk about a little bit because we've had some difficulty with it. We also survey parents and teachers in the spring, so lots of stuff going on so we can have lots of insight into how this is working. The last thing we do, of course, is that at that point, they typically come into kindergarten in the district, and we follow them through administrative data at that point, okay? So they're doing less active data collection at that point. So just to kind of give you a sense of where we are, this is where we are in the study right now. We have 2 cohorts that have either started or gone through pre-K, and our objective is to get all of our cohorts through at least 3rd grade, and who knows, we'll see what happens, okay? So the last randomized cohort will finish preschool in 2019. So I'll just say very quickly that, let's see if I want to spend too much time on this. I'll actually skip and talk about it in this way. I think it's really interesting to think about what did parents actually opt to do with these offers, so I'll talk about that a little bit. The students in the control group were offered this spot in a half-day class. 33 of those students left Westminster altogether. They had some other childcare arrangement. 10 actually ended up switching to full day to fill slots because there's a mandate that these classrooms have to have 16 kids in them. So sometimes they had to cross over from a wait list that we randomized. And about 61% remained in the half-day classrooms throughout the year. And I think that's interesting in that it's obviously quite different than what goes on in this treatment group, where we see 86% of the kids remaining in their full-day classroom. So this is just beginning to suggest that this is something that parents want and matters to them, and has an effect for the district in terms of clients taking up their services, which is very important to them, something they're looking to increase. I won't tell you too much about the nitty-gritty details of like how we did in our data collection. We did okay. We did well. And but the main thing that that we should point to is that generally it's harder to get data from study families that were not enrolled in Westminster. So that's just something I want to highlight because that's a challenge in terms of what that can introduce in terms of bias. So that's something that we're working really, really hard on, is to really stick with those families because those families tend to be in our half-day condition. Likewise, these problems can overlap essentially. Some data that we get, we only get from the district about district kids. And so these two things can overlap and can make it more difficult. So you can see our coverage rates, they're all pretty high. And then we do a lot of sensitivity analyses to think about whether what we're finding could be trumped by these parts that we don't know about. So I'll just say a little bit today. I'm going to share with you some primary outcome data for our year 1 cohort. And I will also just say briefly that we have 3 cohorts because we are underpowered with 1 cohort. That's why we did 3. So we weren't really expecting to find anything. So it's going to be interesting to see that we do find something. And so I'll share that with you. We're going to talk particularly about achievement outcomes right now. But we have lots of other stuff that we can look at. We can look at parental reports of their early childhood investments, perceptions of their child's development. That's on our survey. We ask a lot of questions about parent and family ability to work and how they feel about whether childcare constrains their ability to work. We also talk to the teachers about their perceptions of all of the individual kids. So we also have attendance data. There's a lot that we can do here. This is just a quick graph to show that we actually have an incredibly rich set of pretreatment covariates because these kids are coming into the school district for the very first time, and so they're doing a lot of work to get a complete history of what these children have been through and what their experiences are, what their parents' education is like. And so on the one hand, that's great because we can check covariate balance, and that's for the most part went pretty well. We have one that's kind of off, but kind of a low probability of events, percentage of families with a history of frequent moves. But the other thing that's really interesting here is that we actually, this actually strengthens our power a lot because we have so much ability to explain variance in our outcomes because we have this information. And I think that's like a lesson that I have learned from doing this, is just thinking about that a little bit more closely. So when you do an RCT, this is the moment. So here's our table. So what you'll see here is that on the upper half, we have intent to treat estimated effects and treatment untreated on the lower panel. So the treatment here is being assigned, being offered full day. And then we have a series of outcomes, PPVT, EZR, and then TS Gold is actually something that the district collects. So we're looking at that even though there's some issues with who has that data. And so, the main thing to find there is that, there are large statistically significant effects, particularly in PPVT and all of the TS Gold outcomes. We're not seeing so much traction on the special needs screener, which is something we're going to dig into that a little bit more because it has several sections, so we're going to check into that. You can see, our sample sizes here, so like this is not a lot of kids, but big effects. So sort of exciting. And of course, our treatment untreated estimates are more intense, even larger. I feel like I have to just wait for you to look at this for a while. That's it. So, so just some observations about these findings. Something I don't show, but is to be expected is our control variables, controlling or not, doesn't do much to change our estimates. Effects are larger on PPVT than on EZR. The EZR estimates are close to 0. All of them except the EZR are actually substantively large, and that we're surprised that we're finding something this early in the game. We'll see what happens when they move into kindergarten. We're working on that right now. What happens at this point, usually in this talk, is that, I've only given it once, so what happened last time in this talk is that people instantly want to know, well, what's happening in the rest of that day? And so I'm just going to share 2 graphs. We're just beginning to look at this. They're kind of teasers. They're very hot off the presses, so we can look at them together. Okay, we have all this evidence, but I'm going to use what parents and teachers told us about this. So this is a report from teachers. They tell us about their typical schedules every day of the week in full versus half day. So the blue is is half day and the red is in full. And this is the average minutes per day. So important to just think about that metric. Of course, we expect the red bars to be higher because there's much more time in that day. I will also mention that kids in half day are getting 3 hours a day for 4 days a week, and the full day are getting 7 hours a day for 5 days a week. So it's a big treatment contrast. And so you can kind of see that there's some interesting patterns here. I was a little bit anticipating this finding because in hearing teachers in this district talk, they very much believe in play. This is a play district, that's what they call themselves. And so to them, they think that like the fact that they're getting to do lots of unstructured play is kind of the story here. The last thing I want to show you is kind of an interesting graph about how parents cover the workday time when they're not in Westminster. So thinking a little bit about our 4 groups. So we have the group of families who are, this is actually not about the randomization, this is just descriptive, who are in AM full day. So they have 11 to 6 p.m. That's our kind of time, our work hours that we're looking at, uncovered. PM, they have 8 to 12 uncovered and 3 to 6 uncovered. Our full day only has that 3 to 6 uncovered. And then, of course, our non-Westminster have to figure out ways to cover all of that time. And there's some interesting patterns here about kind of how these are different. And, you know, just in general, just seeing how many fewer resources and how many fewer challenges this group has in terms of coverage. And there are also some very interesting findings, which I won't talk about too much right now, about differences in whether an AM or PM schedule changes the way that you may have to cover this time. So I'm excited that we can start to look at some of this information and try to tease apart what's going on here. And I'll just leave this slide up. These are the things that we're currently working on: following cohorts, looking for persistence, and we're randomizing the 3rd cohort right now. Thank you.